Okay, so today we'll be taking a look at primary and secondary sources. We're going to start off by looking at what the difference between a primary source and a secondary source is, and then we will learn about how to analyze different sources. And from there we're going to do some guided practice, and that's going to be where I am going to show you how to analyze a primary source and then also how to analyze a secondary source. So let's get started. So before we get into the content for today, we're going to take a look at our state standards. The first one says here, identify within both primary and secondary sources the author, audience, format, and purpose of significant historical documents. And our second standard here states, compare interpretations of key events and issues throughout American history. We're also going to go over our learning goals before we get started. So students will be able to explain the difference between primary and secondary sources. Students will be able to provide examples of primary and secondary sources. And finally, students will be able to analyze and explain primary and secondary sources. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to take a look at are primary sources. Primary sources are first-hand accounts of an event by someone who actually experienced or witnessed the event. So someone who was, actually present for something happening, like say maybe the March on Washington. If they were to have, written a letter or taken a photograph, that would be considered a primary source. Some examples are diaries, letters, photographs, speeches, and interviews. Next up we have secondary sources. So a secondary source is going to be an account of an event that was created later by somebody who did not experience the event firsthand. So these examples of these are going to be books. Your textbook would be an example of a secondary source. Newspaper articles and political cartoons. So all of these were created by someone who did not experience the event firsthand. So we're looking at how to analyze sources now. And when we analyze sources, these rules are going to be good for both primary and secondary sources. So when we analyze these sources, we are going to want to identify several things right off the bat. And that is going to be this first bullet point here. We're going to want to identify the author, the title of the document or source, the date of the source, and where the source comes from. So if it's out of a magazine or a textbook, a newspaper, a diary, whatever that may be. And then also if we're looking at a picture or a political cartoon, we're going to want to see if there's a caption. And again, there may not always be all of these incorporated with a source. It just depends on the source. So that's why we have the and or at the end of the sentence, because it may not always have all of these things. So after we've done that, the next thing we're going to do is read or view the document. So when we do this, there's several things we're going to want to do. First, we're going to want to be thinking about who the document was meant to be seen by. So who is the audience that this document is intended for? Next, and this has to do with actually interacting with the document, you're going to want to underline, circle, or highlight anything that stands out to you as you're reading it. And then also you're going to want to take notes in the margins. This is called annotating. Also, as we're reading through the document, we're going to want to keep in mind the guiding question that we want to answer by examining the document. We're going to want to identify key ideas found in the document. We're going to want to consider biases, which we've talked about in the past. And then once you've read through the whole document and you've taken some notes, you've identified the source, where it comes from, and you've thought about who the audience is, you're going to want to summarize the source in a couple of sentences and work to answer that guiding question. So like I said earlier, we're going to get a little bit of practice. It's mostly just going to be me showing you how to do it. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to examine a primary source together. It's going to be up here on the screen for you in just a minute. But it's going to be a primary source that was written by a loyalist in 1776. And if you remember when we learned about the American Revolution, a loyalist is someone who sided with Great Britain when it came to American independence. And the guiding question for this document that you should be thinking about as we read through it is, why did some colonists support England and oppose independence? So now we're going to do our first guided practice with a primary source. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I am going to identify the title and the date, which are right up here at the top. The title is The True Interest of America Impartially Stated, and it was written in 1776. And then we see down here at the bottom of the source or document, we have the source of it, and it was written by Charles Inglis. He was an Anglican minister, and he wrote this here as a response to the pamphlet Common Sense by Thomas Paine, which we learned about a while back. So now we're going to go ahead and read through this. So I'm just going to read it out loud. Suppose we were to revolt from Great Britain, declare ourselves independent, and set up a republic of our own. What would be the consequence? My blood runs chill when I think of the calamities, the complicated evils that must follow. Devastation and ruin must mark the progress of this war along the seacoast of America. So far, Britain has not exerted her power. Her number of troops and ships of war here at present is very little more than she judged necessary in time of peace. But as soon as we declare independence, ruthless war with all its aggravated horrors will ravage our once happy land. Our seacoasts and ports will be ruined, and our ships taken. Torrents of blood will be spilled, and thousands reduced to beggary and wretchedness. By declaring independence, we would instantly lose all assistance from our friends in England. They will stop saying anything in our favor, for they would be seen as rebels and treated accordingly. The only European power from which we can possibly receive assistance is France. But France is now at peace with Great Britain. And is it possible that France would interrupt that peace and risk another war with England from a disinterested motive of aiding and protecting these colonies? So now that we've read the document, I'm going to give some feedback on what I took away as some key ideas. And as I was reading it, I was also thinking about who I thought the audience might be that this was written for, and I would think that it would be for a colonial American citizen, and that this is kind of a plea to them to support Great Britain as opposed to supporting American independence. So some of the key ideas I took away from this were that it would be terrible to break away from Great Britain. Britain is much stronger than America and would crush them in war, and only the French could help them. But why would the French possibly risk losing the peace that they've gained with Great Britain? So the next thing to think about are biases. So this person, Charles Inglis, is obviously a loyalist. He has a bias towards Great Britain. He has a bias against independence. And also something you might notice is that the title says The True Interest of America Impartially Stated. And impartial means that you're not coming from either side. So really this is a partial document. It is not impartial. So I think that right there, that they put impartial in the title, shows that they're kind of trying to, they're trying a little too hard to show that they aren't biased, because they definitely are. And then also, my summary of this document would be, in a couple sentences, would be that it would be a terrible thing to go to war with Great Britain. Great Britain would crush America in a military fight, and America wouldn't have any allies. And this all relates back to that guiding question of why did some colonists support, or why were some colonists loyalists, and why did they not support independence from Great Britain? And This whole document gives a very good um, response to that, in that this person in particular felt that war would be a terrible thing for America, and that Britain had really been kind to America, and there was no reason to go to war. So that is that for analyzing this primary source. I hope that's been helpful, and we're going to move on to analyzing a secondary source. Alrighty, so we're going to practice one more time with a secondary source, and I'm going to show you how to do that. And we're going to look at a political cartoon that depicts voting literacy tests, and this cartoon was published in 1962. We've talked a little bit about this topic. We haven't gone too in depth, but we do have some background knowledge of that from class. And the guiding question we're going to want to think about while we look at this is, how were literacy tests discriminatory against African Americans? So now we're going to look at this political cartoon. Just take a minute to look at it. Remember, the first things we're going to want to be looking for is not an author in this case, but an artist, the caption, like we talked about, and like I said, this was published in 1962. So this depicts two men. One looks like a sheriff or a police officer. The other is manning the table where a voter literacy test is going to take place. And the caption says, "By the way, what's that big word?" And this just kind of shows that the people giving the tests, who were white, didn't necessarily have the best grasp on literacy themselves. So this shows that most likely, yes, literacy tests were discriminatory against African Americans. So when it comes to summarizing this cartoon, I would say that yes, literacy tests were discriminatory against African Americans, as whites rarely had to take them, if ever. And then also that eventually literacy tests were banned under the Constitution and found unconstitutional. Alrighty, thanks for tuning in, and please fill out your prompts, your essay prompts for this, and I'll see you all in class tomorrow.